more people joining us.
Conference record has joined the conference.
Conference record is here. That's great. Thanks. This is Nora Sonin. I'm a technical advisor here with FHI 360. We're very happy that you have all joined us today. So thank you to those of you in the room and to those of you on the phone. Some of you may already be familiar with the Workforce Connections project, but for those of you who aren't, this is a USAID-funded initiative to build the evidence base on workforce development programming and to create a community of practice of workforce development practitioners to engage in peer-to-peer learning. As part of this project, we have been awarding a series of learning grants to organizations on the topics of soft skills and systems thinking. We're very excited to have LINC with us here today. They have been awarded the first of these grants to do a series of organizational network analyses of labor market systems in Nicaragua. So we have with us today Patrick Somerville and Rich Fromer, who are the founders and managing directors of LINC. They're going to tell you about their proposal, and we hope to get your feedback on this proposal and your thoughts. I think I'm going to be very brief in my remarks, so I'm going to let Patrick and Rich take it away. For those of you on the phone, if you've just joined us, please mute your microphones. There will be a chance to ask questions at the end. If you're joining us on the LINC webinar application, you can also text us or chat us your questions. So we'll have an ample amount of time for that towards the end of the presentation. I don't know if you guys want to take questions throughout or if you'd prefer to take them at the end.
There are going to be a few moments where we're going to be specifically asking for input and feedback from the crowd. I mean, the idea of this whole session is that it's not just to present what we're planning to do, but to really get input from people who are focused on both the kind of systems thinking type issues, workforce development issues, and hopefully in particular where those two overlap. So did think perhaps it would be worth it for at least just to get a feel for. This is Rich Fromer from LINC, and so to follow up on that, we thought it would be good to at least hear from everyone in the room a name and organization that you're here with. So perhaps Patrick, you can.
I'm Patrick Somerville. I'm from LINC, and we'll be presenting on some of the methodology and questionnaire and other related aspects of our research.
Kevin Wheeler of the Kaizen Company.
Laura Goldmark, FHI 360, Director of the Workforce Connections Project. Independent consultant. I do some work with DAI and NetHealth on youth and workforce development.
Susie Lusumbo from RTI International, Workforce Economic Opportunities Team.
Matt Dietz, FHI 360, Associate Director for Civil Society and the Civil Society Program Department.
Tommy Galloway, also FHI 360.
Jacqueline Williams, FHI 360. I work on Workforce Connections as well.
Thanks, Mark Ranius. I'm about 2 weeks back from Uzbekistan, where I did a year-and-a-half PSC contract with USAID, now doing consulting with Counterpart International.
I'm Felix Alvarado with the Trubin Consulting. I'm also an independent consultant.
We go to the people on the phone as well.
Anyone?
No typing.
Anybody?
Anna Barlock from ACDA VOCA and the LEO project.
And this is Elizabeth Dunn, also working with ACDA VOCA on the LEO project.
Victoria Nash with the International Youth Foundation.
Caroline Fawcett with Workforce Connections.
Hello.
Yeah.
Anyone else?
Yeah.
Yeah, I was just saying hi. Susan Pizzullo from the International Youth Foundation.
Okay. Yeah, hello everybody. Good morning. My name is Carlos Marroquin. I'm from El Salvador, and I'm representing a local forum called Social Communications. We have experience making social network campaigns for workforce development here in El Salvador, and it was a very successful campaign, and I'm very glad to know about what Nicaragua is doing.
Grace Akukwe, Creative Associates.
Yes, Caroline Fawcett from Workforce Connections. I'm a consultant.
This is Sarah Barbarossa from RTI International.
Anybody else? Okay, great.
Great. Thanks. Just a reminder for the people dialed in, just to minimize the noise on this end, if you could mute if you're not speaking, that would be appreciated.
No.
So, all right, again, thanks to everyone. It does sound like we've got a very diverse group, so hopefully that means we'll have a lively conversation and some interesting feedback from everyone. We do want to thank, right from the start, USAID and FHI 360 and Workforce Connections for arranging all of this, and of course, for the grant itself. And Jackie and Nora in particular, who spent a lot of time working with us on this aspect of the consultation event. As Nora said at the beginning, we're very happy to be here because we're really excited to get this project started, and the idea of these grants is that they are learning grants. So the idea is that we all want to get something out of this that we can then use or apply to the projects that we're all working on elsewhere, not just in Nicaragua, but around the world. And so this is going to be a great opportunity and great starting point for us to gather some feedback from people in the room and on the phone, and to adjust the learning objectives as well as some of the aspects of the project itself. So basically the stuff we're going to cover today during the presentation, we're going to give some background on organizational network analysis in general, and and its applicability to workforce development, of course. We're going to give some specifics of the activity that we're planning to run in Nicaragua, and then of course there's the feedback component, which there will be obvious moments during this discussion where we clearly want some feedback, but feel free to speak up if you've got questions or comments. And if it's something that we're going to cover later, we can always put that off a little. So with that in mind, we've already heard a bit about Workforce Connections. Just a couple words about LINC. We are 2 years old, so a very young organization, really getting started on this. We're very focused on local solutions and local systems, and we've been doing a lot of research and testing over the past year plus, specifically on the systems lens and on tools like this organizational network analysis. We're also, just as part of our reason for forming the organization, we were very interested in gathering enough data and seeing and comparing results of projects and programs around the world to really understand and give back to the community. So we're very interested in this type of learning activity and pushing forward the knowledge and skills and tools that we all as development practitioners have and can use. So we've been involved a bit in tool development, but also methodology testing and different types of initiatives and activities, and we've also got a goal to be able to collect enough data that we can influence some policy or other decision making around the way systems is incorporated into development. So I think we can start with some conversation. I'm sure some people in the room have different amounts of experience or interaction with social network analysis or organizational network analysis. Here, just speaking generally about social network analysis, we've got a few bullet points on the slide, but the general idea is it measures relationships or interconnections between individuals or organizations. And so in that way, it's very tied to this elusive calculation of social capital. And so a lot of the scores that come out of social network analyses can be used as proxies for social capital measurement. And we can see some of those changes over time as well related to social capital and how that might impact projects. It allows us to, because it does both a mapping and create some scores, it allows us to visualize as well as measure, in some cases, the systems level dynamics or statics, in some cases, of the networks or organizations or ecosystems that we're working within. So it pushes us to use more systems thinking and to understand the system as a whole and how changing one piece of a system might affect or not affect other aspects of that system. As I was saying, you can measure, because it gives us this visualization, but it also calculates a number of scores at the network level overall. We can calculate health of the network, and we can also calculate scores for individual actors within a network. And so it gives a little bit of information at both of those levels. It's also important to note that generally speaking, social network analysis has been applied at the individual level, so it's measuring connections between people, individual people. That has its value both in international development and in other sectors. We have been mostly trying to see how this might apply at the organizational level. And so that's why what we're working on is called organizational network analysis as opposed to just social network analysis, but it's basically a subset of social network analysis. In terms of its application to international development programs, we've been seeing it hasn't been extensively used in international development, but we are starting to see a little bit more interest, and certainly most times that we end up speaking about this or presenting on this, there is a lot of interest from the community on this topic. And but one of the things we've got here, systems mapping and stakeholder analysis, one of the things to point out is that they're not really analogous or perfectly analogous. They're complementary activities, a stakeholder analysis or a system mapping that the ONA might be able to produce. A stakeholder analysis often goes into a lot of detail about the interests and the power that different actors within a system might have. It may not look at all of the actors that are affected by a system as well, though ideally it would, where an organizational network analysis allows us both to identify perhaps some of the actors that we would not have identified through more anecdotal means, and it also it allows us to see the relationships, but as you can see on the last bullet of potential limitations, it measures the relationships. It does not measure the nature of the organizations themselves or the actors within the network. So, it's important just to understand that this would not necessarily replace a more formal stakeholder analysis, but it adds a lot more detail to that, or a stakeholder analysis could add more detail to the results of an organizational network analysis. Some of the other key uses that we've been finding and working on are the ability to identify potential partners and potential intervention strategies within programs, so the program design aspect of it, as well as repeating this measurement over time so we have a baseline and we can measure changes over time in the network or with individual actors within the network, so which could help us with adaptive management within programs or impact measurement at the end of a program or also during a program. We also have noticed that as networks become more healthy, and the measure of what is healthy or isn't healthy is part of what we're hoping to learn for workforce development through this project. But networks that are more healthy also will lead to more sustainable interventions or results of the projects that we're working on. So that's part of the hypothesis of this as well. One other important note on the potential limitations here, the third bullet there, measurement typically in one mode. So It's possible to do social network analysis where you're measuring connections between individuals, and it's possible to do it at a number of other levels of a network, or depending on the definition of your network. You know, we've been using an analogy of education or classrooms. You know, you could do a network analysis that measures relationships between the students, or you could do a network measurement of relations between different classes within the same grade or within the same school. You could do a network analysis of the different grades and how they interact with each other, or different schools within a school district or whatever you're measuring. So there's a lot of different levels that can be approached here. And you can, depending on the way that you define that network, you can do some mixing of those levels, but it's important to define that, what we call here the mode as well. And it's one complication that we have found is very difficult to measure both connections between individuals and connections between organizations in the same exercise. So again, we're focused on the organization level of this, or the mode of measuring connections between organizations, more than reaching out to individual stakeholders within any network that we're talking about. And then just in terms of social network analysis or organizational network analysis and how it fits into workforce connections and workforce development, and more specifically labor market assessment, workforce connections, it has put together this toolkit of both a process and a number of tools and methodologies that can be used for labor market assessments, mostly focused on the data collection and decision-making and analysis that can be done to come up with recommendations for program design. And so what we're talking about here, again, is that it fits clearly into this toolkit under the heading of, what do we have here, systems and stakeholder mapping, which is part of the initial data gathering part of the toolkit. And we see that there's a clear use for the results of organizational network analysis within the toolkit, and so that's a big piece of what we're testing here. We are convinced that that organizational network analysis, we've already been applying it in a number of different sectors and contexts. We're convinced that it really can be applied and very valuable to a lot of these contexts. This will be our first use of it within workforce development, and so we're very excited to see how that fits in. One thing to focus on here is, again, this particular project, it's a short project. We're looking at the specific context of Nicaragua as a snapshot of this time. So we're not in this project going to look at the measurement of changes over time, though that is another clear use that this could be applied for. At the moment, it's going to be a snapshot that's really, as many programs are getting started in Nicaragua, or some programs are ongoing. So we'll be able to see this can be used as a baseline that we can then measure again later, or at the moment it can be used to really help with the program design of projects that are just getting started or will get started in the near future.
Great. I'll take over here. This is Patrick. I'm going to speak in some level of detail about the research design and lay out for you the approach, as we've developed and articulated it so far, and look for some discrete opportunities for input from you. So. The first thing is really just to be very clear on the research hypothesis that we have, which is basically asserting that ONA can be a value add to labor market assessment activities, specifically in regards to its ability to identify systems level opportunities and constraints. There's a few learning objectives embedded into there. The first one is very explicitly test the tool's relevance to workforce development as a sector. The second is really regarding Nicaragua specifically. We have just completed a strategy activity with USAID in Nicaragua on workforce development, and found no excess of information in this area. There's a lot of anecdote, but it became quickly apparent to us that something of this nature would be of value. So, and as a sideline to that, we are doing a similar consultation in Nicaragua next week to verify and clarify really a number of elements of our research design. In Nicaragua, we're partnering quite closely with, of course, USAID as well as SDC, the Swiss Development Cooperation Funder, which is doing quite a lot of work in this area as well. And in general, workforce development is a very, very active sector in Nicaragua, as many of you may know. So, lastly is to provide some comparative insight. We think, because this is a learning grant, we should learn as much as we possibly can. So we've been quite strategic in putting forward 3 networks that we think are sufficiently distinct that will enable us to most likely and hopefully get some interesting comparative insights around things like urban, rural, agriculture versus service, complex networks versus simple networks, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. By the way, can everybody make sure their microphone is muted? We're getting feedback from one. I think we can go to the next slide. First of all, we really want to answer, or we want to clarify what ONA can answer for us. There's really 2 levels at which organizational network analysis works. It's a whole network level, and it's an individual actor level, otherwise known as ego level. You can see pretty clearly in that diagram the differentiation between the 2. And from the same data set, we're able to do those 2 different levels of analysis. Some of the real high lines in terms of what we can learn from the whole network and the ego network are highlighted there. The key element here, really, typically the way the process will play out will be an initial projection of whole network maps, and there may be some different projections, according to different attributes that we assign to the network. But generally, we first look at the whole network to learn who are the actors that are most interesting to us. Most obviously, it would be the most central actors, or those that are positioned along key kind of gateways or bridges between clusters of actors. But it may also be an actor that a project is already considering working with, that we want to learn more about their actual relations and how they fit within the larger system and network. So, some of the key questions there, you can focus on, we really, the network analyst, in terms of a whole network level, really is looking at informational pathways and the fastest speed at which information disseminates throughout a network. That's fundamentally what we measure. The relationships or the ties that we measure are informational ties. They're not currency or automobiles or things like that. So we're really looking for as much, a lot of people use the term triangulation. And frankly, that's exactly what network analysts look for, triangulation. Being able to, one specific actor having access to redundant information sources. So that's kind of a key concept there. There's a lot of interesting things we can look at that larger level, that we can see at that larger level. There may be clusters that we weren't aware of. There may be an NGO that we've been talking to for years, but we discovered they're actually not talking to anybody except us. There's a lot of, and perhaps most importantly, we can look at something called centrality, which in our lingo would probably be hierarchy and power. And the more central actors can exert a lot of influence over a network, which can be a good thing or can be a bad thing. So we look at those kinds of factors. All right, I think, I think we can probably move on to the next slide. Okay. ONA helps program design. Ultimately, why are we doing this? We're doing this so we can design better programs, okay? And we think that network analysis has a role in enhanced program design. There's a few things, I think generally, and, we as mostly international development practitioners are very comfortable with high levels of ambiguity. And in our program design efforts, oftentimes not a lot of attention or sufficient attention goes to understanding the relationships or the power structures of local actors in areas where we're doing work. And that includes power structures that are indeed ourselves and influence that NGOs or donors themselves may be exerting over a network. So we come into these scenarios and in design programs and select partners, although we most typically always have to answer these questions that we have up here. The first and the third questions, with whom should we work and support to the many or few, really are actor-based type questions, partner selection type questions. Is it really best that we're supporting the strongest actor in a certain area, or the actor with the most funding, or the actor with the most relationships? Should we be looking at more strategic, but smaller actors that we may not have noticed before that are playing important bridging roles between various clusters or things like that? So we're answering those types of questions. I think numbers 2 and 4, facilitation or direct intervention and bolstering resource hubs or incubating new relationships, tend to be fairly fundamental questions in program design as well, and very much can be very much differentiated by the results we see from an ONA. We, I think, in general, may have a bias towards facilitation and working with actors that are already performing certain functions within a particular ecosystem, but it just may not be practical on the basis of the relationships they have, which this measures, or a more in-depth capacity assessment with some of the tools that many of us are familiar with. So looking at that. And then bolstering resource hubs or incubating new relationships are very different strategies, and ones that can quite obviously be seen when you begin projecting these network maps. And we will give you an example of some of that at the end of this presentation. I think we can keep moving. Oh, there we go. All right. Just regarding the ONA activity, as Rich says, it goes from now till September. Right now we're doing the consultations. We'll be customizing our instruments immediately after field surveying for about 2 months, and we'll talk usually in these rooms, there's the people that want to know about the technical stuff, and there's the people that want to know about the survey methodology. We'll be talking quite a bit about the survey methodology in the next few slides. And then conducting data analysis and doing our reporting in September. These specific consultations as you can see on the bottom, we really hope are going to help us in this research design phase. And there will be a sharing phase at the end of this, which we hope all of you will be engaged in terms of sharing the reports and doing a similar event. We're also will be presenting our work at the Making Sense Youth Economic Opportunities Conference on October 7th, and generating a case study as well that'll get into some of the nitty-gritty on our lessons learned around the process of all this in cooperation with the systems working group of Workforce Connections. So I think we can keep going. This is just a quick visual on the comparative aspect of this. Yeah, I believe the next slide will have a bit more detail in terms of questions, and we'd be interested to get the group's thinking here as well. As I mentioned at the beginning, we haven't entirely nailed down the locations, but we're getting quite close. It will definitely be Managua. It will most likely be Leon or Chinandega. And then for the last, it will be one of the three below, although Matagalpa and Jinoteca there's quite a lot of overlap in. You can see the comparisons that we think are possible. On the left is the interesting comparison for the network analyst, which is a complex network like Managua versus a much simpler network like Leon. The more data you have, the more diversity of actors you have, typically the less constraint there are on individual actors, and the freer information flows, and basically the networks are more dynamic. That'll be interesting to see if it actually holds true. In terms of over on the arrows on the right, these are more specific to workforce development type questions, looking at an industry services dominated network versus an agricultural one, and then the rural urban question, which we know certainly in workforce development programming represents quite dramatic differences in opportunities and approaches. So I'm going to ask for the group's feedback on this slide, because I think our collective knowledge is much greater than my own here. Urban-rural, I was thinking about this a little bit more the other day, and it'll be interesting to see how far we can push the results to actually provide us with, I think, meaningful conclusions or ideas about workforce development specifically. I think there's a number of assumptions that we have about urban versus rural networks. We think they're denser. The entrepreneurial one, we think they're probably entrepreneurial, although in rural areas, a lot of actually the workforce development programming that gets done is entrepreneurial or informal or not formal job placement type activities. So if we can make a strong association between that and network composition, I think it'll be very interesting. And certainly in doing network analysis, one is able to see, and we may bring this out in the example we present later, but one is able to certainly assess the level of entrepreneurship or bridging type activities, relationships that are currently present or possible among different types of groups. So those are some of the key urban-rural ones. Agriculture, industry, I think I mentioned a few things there. I think I'm very curious to learn if agricultural and industrial networks, if there's a difference in just the density of them. Again, I think there's an assumption that that the industry networks can be quite dense. However, I think it is possible we may see quite a lot of clustering of networks of tight collaboration in one place and another place, but maybe not a lot of overlap between them. Whereas agricultural networks, I think the assumption would be that they're more diffuse and they're smaller, but nobody's really told us that's true or false at the moment. And then complex versus simple. When we ultimately we're talking about number of actors there and their functions within a workforce development system. We anticipate that Managua will be a complex one, and the other two will be significantly simpler. So, do people? We don't have all the answers on this stuff, but do people have answers to anything I've asked or additional questions they think might be interesting? Eric? Yeah.
Well, hi. My name is Eric Carter. I'm USAID, and I used to be in the DRG Center and working on civil society media, so our program, Solidarity Center. Anyway, my experience with networks and questions you're asking here.
Hi, we can't hear anything.
Okay, I'll just speak up. I didn't say anything important yet anyway.
Okay. Everything you say is important.
So my name is Eric Picard, and I'm now with the Small Business Office, Small and Disadvantaged Business Utilization Office at USAID. Anyway, we partnered with, when I was in the DRG Center, we partnered with the International Center for Not-for-Profit Law, and in close collaboration with the mission. This was at the mission's behest, to help civil society organizations in Nicaragua address essentially legal and regulatory threats around the NGO laws and regs. And so, first of all, I'd say you should definitely, if you haven't already, speak with Jocelyn Nieva, who is one of ICNL's 2 point persons on that project, and basically they implemented the activity by going to Nicaragua and working, for a week at a time or so with a network of civil society organizations, and basically helping them strategize and mentoring them as they, implemented the plan. I'm pretty sure that at least one of the key organizations was sort of a think tank that's been very effective and has been recognized for their outstanding work in the past. But I would say, having said that in terms of considering whether urban versus rural, you might want to think of in terms of, at the rural level, what challenges have they had to respond to that might have brought them together, those organizations. And I'd say that, in Nicaragua over the last several years, there have been serious threats to civil society. So whether you're a rural-based organization or an urban-based organization, you still have to do something. And it would be interesting to know exactly which organizations, where they were located, where they were based, participated with, that ICNL activity supported by the DRG Center and the mission.
Thanks.
A couple of comments, I guess, more than questions. On the urban networks, are they denser or not? It struck me that maybe you'd have to qualify dense along what lines, especially because I'm thinking if you're talking about information exchange, It's really about the speed and facility of communications, and that no longer is strictly geographical. So you might intuitively think that geography, urban geography is more compact and thus more dense.
Yeah.
But it doesn't necessarily follow if what you're doing is exchanging information, because a phone will get you anywhere, any moment. So the question might have to do with thinking about that dimension of connectivity, being able to figure it out. And I also think not in the case of Nicaragua, but for example in the case of El Salvador, where you have a very dense country with a lot of urban centers, but also important breakdown because of the issue with gangs and security. So people, even though they are densely packed geographically, are not able to connect in fact. And so again, that illustrates, if you want, in the negative, this thought that the qualification that I was doing. The other one is also just a qualification about when you talk about entrepreneurship and are you more entrepreneurial or not. I also think you need to think a bit about how you qualify that term entrepreneurial, because you can be an entrepreneur because you want to be an entrepreneur and you have certain characteristics and empowerment to do it, or you're a survival entrepreneur because there's nothing else you can do. And I think it's going to be very different whether you find, people in rural areas probably going to find, especially in small towns, in rural areas, you're going to find people who are entrepreneurial, but that basically means you have a survival corner store where you have 5 things because that's the only thing you can do with your spare time as a mother of 9, and then is that entrepreneurship? So you have to find that very carefully.
Yeah, and that's an important differentiation to make. An entrepreneurial network is not necessarily a network that's full of entrepreneurial individuals. All right, so we'll need to make a differentiation between those things, and we're, I think, in many senses talking about after we look at a whole network, assessing the extent to which entrepreneurial opportunities are present, and we look at that through cohesion of a network versus being a very insular one, and things like that.
So just to clarify, because I actually had that question in my head when you said entrepreneurial.
Yes.
What do you mean? So are you talking about organizations being entrepreneurial, i.e. starting up new initiatives to work together on the workforce problem, for example? Would that be an example of
an example? If we did, for example, the ego level analysis on an interesting organization in a rural area, we may discover that their network is quite closed, or is composed of a number of kind of hub and spoke type things where people aren't talking to each other, and they're not accessing other broader actors in a network. In that case, it represents quite a lot of constraint on that actor to access redundant information, number one, or to engage in new activities, or more broadly speaking, probably represents a bias against new entrants into the network. So we're talking about that versus something where there's broader relationships that are fairly cohesive and redundant across the network. So I don't know if they're exactly the same thing, because when we talk about entrepreneurship versus employment, it is a little bit different, but it may be germane just to be able to look at, ultimately we're kind of asking here, what are the opportunities for dynamicism, to be dynamic for organizations in these rural areas.
Hi, this is Susan Pizzullo from International Youth Foundation. I also wonder maybe if there's a bit of a false dichotomy between urban and rural. I think it was also what the gentleman from El Salvador was getting at. I think I'm looking at this strictly from the point of view of understanding the labor market and how we can understand it better to begin to deal more intelligently with the skills mismatch, which is the focus of a lot of our work. And I think what we found is that even from city to city in the same country, the information can be it can be less shared. It can be more concentrated. It can be embedded, even within a company, within a cluster. So we see differences urban to urban. So I just wanted to throw that out there, is that I don't think, I'm not saying that relative to rural it may be more dense, but certainly depending on the way oftentimes the private sector is structured, how organized it is, what kind of gatekeepers there are, how good their information is. Sometimes it's very difficult to even get consensus. It can be pulling teeth, and there isn't that connectivity that would make your job easier. And again, I think in countries where they have, norms and set up by industry that allow you to look at competency-based schemes, it can make the work of trying to get this intelligence out, and then understanding that this is a consensus that can help inform the design of what you do with young people or whoever, so that you have a stronger workforce, can be somewhat easier. So anyway, just wanted to throw that out there.
That's a great point. Yep.
I'm with FHI 360. Sorry, I came late, so you may have covered this. But was a part of the analysis to look at the range of money between nodes or actions?
No, there's two types of network analysis, and they reflect very differently in their composition and the actual analysis that's done around them. There's material and informational. We're looking at informational. So we're looking at collaboration rather than transactions, really, yeah.
But even within informational, I think it could be useful for us to have a little more understanding of what defines an edge, what kind of information is being shared or thought or...
Yeah, we'll talk about that. That's coming up.
Personally, before I could give...
Okay. Maybe we should advance. Yeah.
Like if you could define redundant information, you mentioned before, information redundancies or redundant information.
Yeah, information redundancies are ultimately being able to access information from the same information from more than one source.
What does that teach us?
It enables accurate information to be diffused in a faster manner. So, yeah.
And allows the organizations that have access to multiple sources of information to make better decisions.
And those actors are at an advantage.
But it's the same information.
Or similar information on the same topic that, again, as Petra was saying, sort of the triangulation of the final information that you want. So you may not get information in exactly the form that you're looking for, but getting it from this source and this source allows you to see how the whole picture fits together.
Let's talk more. Let's keep going, because we're starting to get specific into a lot of the stuff that we're going to talk more about. Defining the network. This is probably the most important job that we have to get done before we implement this census, and it is a census as distinguished from a survey. All right, a survey takes a sample. A census pulls all actors in a network. The reason it's done that way is because, as you can see from a network diagram, every node, which are the actors, are connected to another node through an edge, which is the tie. Okay, so you have to sense it. You have to define the network quite closely, quite carefully. When you reach the boundary of that network, you stop, or when you run out of referrals, and then compile the information on the basis of all responses, not a sample of responses. The way we're doing that with this particular survey, there's a few different techniques that can be used. The one we're planning on using is a snowball census approach. Basically, you start with referrals of actors that meet your network definition, which we'll be working on quite intensively in Nicaragua in our consultation events, and some of the people that we're using to help us with this activity. And then you do the census with them, you complete the questionnaire with them, and they refer you to all of the other organizations. So it's a snowball. Then you reach out to those organizations. You clarify that they do actually qualify as a network member, and you interview them, and so on and so forth. And, you know, we budget a fairly significant amount of our time to this activity because it is quite complicated to manage and time intensive. Here's what we think in terms of a network definition, and let's be clear that to be, for that bottom left bit, they do have to be organizations, they do have to operate within the geography we're looking at, and they do have to consist of actors with a common goal, which is advancing workforce development. So in terms of our definition, the one we're working with right now is operating within the appropriate geography. The second one is a goal or a mission related one, increasing the quality or quantity of jobs and or labor supply. It's a very general statement because we have to have employers in here and some fairly diverse actors. Are formally registered as entities to operate in Nicaragua. There's going to be some clarification in Nicaragua on that one, so we probably shouldn't get into that. The fourth one is primarily targeted towards employers. It is targeted towards employers, and they can't just be people that hire people, otherwise our network would never end. We'd just be continuously referred to other employers and other employers, and we'd never, it would never end. But we do want to make sure that those employers that are actively engaged in workforce development initiatives and coordination are surveyed, okay? So ultimately, to qualify as a network member, as an employer, you have to have a relationship with another non-employer actor of the network. And five, they're not simply job seekers. Rich talked before about the individual organizational mode issue. And the fact that network analysis doesn't assess people's or organizations' nature or perceptions. That's the business of household surveys and other types of instruments, and the qualitative knowledge that we have, fortunately. So we can't really survey or census job seekers, but we can look at the relationships that several types of organizations have that are probably some pretty good proxies for them, such as labor unions, NGOs that do job placement, advocacy, that sort of thing. So.
Can I make a quick comment?
Yeah.
Laura, I'd be very careful with number one, your geographic boundaries. Here's why. What if all these guys are talking to each other through some random university in Costa Rica that they're hooked up with? You don't want to lose that, right? You don't want to get distracted, but maybe you can have some sort of criteria, like if all of a sudden X number, like you're able to identify that there's somehow their links are linked to somebody that's outside the geography. I think that might be relevant. You don't want to go too far down that road, but I see number one and I get a little concerned that you might miss something.
Yeah, I mean, we also expect to see that, for example, donors like USAID are based in Managua, let's say USAID Nicaragua. So they're based in Managua, but they operate within some of these other locations. So yeah, there's going to be some flexibility there for sure. It needs to be groups that are involved in some kind of information exchange within that network. So they don't need to be physically present there. And we're hoping that would mean that if there is a university in Costa Rica, for example, that is involved in
right. So your word operate maybe.
Right. The operate may be the
definition of operate
needs to adjust or be more flexible, right?
Yeah, and I think in the next slide we're going to talk about, yes, let's go to the next slide that relates.
Types of organizations.
Yeah. And that's a particularly germane point for things like government, national governments, a big overlapping actor here. This is where we get down to things like assigning attributes, which sounds kind of boring, but is really important. So we can analyze, so we're able to analyze collaboration between groups. So we're able to look at the sector stuff that we just talked about and network types. So the biggest thing that we really have to clarify is organizational types, because we're probably going to see a lot of clusters or collaboration units that run along the function, essentially. You know, TVETs may not be collaborating with employers, which is one of the suspicions we have that Rich will talk about a bit more about. So this kind of typology allows us to get at that. You can see in that list we have employers, we have training providers, we have policy authorities, employment service providers, unions, industry association, NGO, donor funder. We still haven't quite clarified where co-ops fall and the extent to which we're going to get hit with co-ops, but we bet we will. So we have to speak with the Nicaragua folks quite a bit more about that. And then you can see the way we're trying to resolve the invariable government confusion. There's the geographic issue, which was just highlighted, but then there's also all these overlapping government authorities, and what are they actually doing other than being the government, and how do we classify them? So we're suggesting a functional classification of several of the government actors, which is basically bullet points 2 through 4. Yeah. So if it's a public or a private agency that does workforce development training, if it's a public or private agency that, or if it's a local or national regulatory authority, or if it's an employment service provider, public or private. So those are some of the highlights there. Any comments or questions around that? Yeah.
Just a quick one about your types. In a way, it suggests to me that the things in the parentheses are in a way more significant as typology than the main terms. I'm thinking a bit about the experience in education with essential functions. What you perhaps want to look for are, what are the essential functions of a network that does workforce development? And so you can see one of them is obviously employment, another one is funding, another one is regulation, further one might just be, make it up, whatever it is. And then you start thinking about the actors, the organizational actors belonging to those categories. Because after all, I look at NGOs and I think, yeah, of course they might be advocates, but they can also be employers.
Yeah.
People find jobs there, just like private sector employer is not the only kind of employer in a workforce development network. You can get a job with government. So it actually makes more sense to think conceptually about employment and then think who's providing that employment. So just a thought about, how to...
I just want to second that. I really appreciate that. And I was sitting here making notes about, I don't know how many of you have seen the diagram that Nora has put together of a typical labor market system, but I almost sort of feel like how does this relate to that? And perhaps that's a starting point for exactly what you said, which is what are the essential functions. I would like to see this somehow grounded in what we already know about workforce systems.
Yeah.
Absolutely respecting the methodology, but I think that's great.
Great.
No, in fact, these can be completely redefined or defined at any time. This question is a fundamental part of the questionnaire, but is not a fundamental part of the relationships themselves. Right. And so it's simply a checkbox that people are going to say we are this type of organization or not. So we can redefine those. The point being, though, whatever we collect at this stage is what we can then we can then manipulate that and combine groups together or break them out, but that's all the detail that we'll have once we've done the survey. So that's where this decision is important.
And you've seen Phil Silos' workforce ecosystem presentation. They've done a really good typology of those functions, so that would be worth looking at as well.
Okay. Yes, one important point that we're planning to do, and that I think will make the most sense, is we do want to ask organizations to say which, if they fit into more than one category, they should select the one that they most feel comfortable with, as opposed to saying, oh, we are all of these.
All right, can I advance now, or is there anything else that, all right. If anybody else has ideas or advice on this, let's talk after, because it's an important step. Okay, and then the last kind of big question bit is structuring the questionnaire. I think we're feeling a bit more confident with this. The questionnaire, we need to have directed ties. We need to see which direction the relationships are moving. And in the world of network analysis, that means who's naming who, okay? We are planning to measure the strength of ties. I think this goes to the earlier question that was asked. We have, you can see over on the right top, are two ideas about measuring strength of ties, and we think we can do both, is assign a value to a relationship type. This is standard practice in the world of network analysis. A one value is a basic collaboration or participation on joint meetings. A two value is something like a joint initiative, and a three value is something like a working relationship, essentially. And then also ask respondents to rank their perceived strength of the collaboration on the Likert scale. The ultimate maps we come out with when we can value the strength of ties are much, much richer than ones where we can only value the presence of a tie. So that's our suggested approach with that. We have to do this open-ended. That create because there's two ways to do this. You can either do an open-ended survey where the respondent fills in the names of organizations they have relationships with, or you can do a roster where they pick. Unfortunately, in this situation where we have to do a census and we don't know all the actors, this is really easy if you're doing a classroom. It's virtually impossible to do a roster if you're doing a workforce development network in Nicaragua. So it has to be open-ended. You can imagine the biases that play into that in terms of the respondent just being able to recall, all the collaborations they've had in the past year. There's a few strategies for that. It's multiple setting up the instrument to accommodate multiple respondents, ideally but not excluding. Ideally at the same time, but not excluding potentially doing it at different times. Making sure the respondent is very well informed or the most well informed in the organization about external relationships, as well as using enumerator prompting techniques. There's not that many questions in these surveys, but the questions take time to answer. So at the end, after the respondent lists all the organizations they have working relationships with, repeating those back, asking, are you sure, are there any more, and then moving on to gain the contact information for them. And then I think the other issue that we run into a lot with network analysis is, and open-ended survey responses in general, is the different names for one organization. I don't know how many names there are for FHI 360, but there's certainly more than one for LINC. There's a lot of you can just envision the issues with that. We're going to pretty tightly manage that one, including some stuff on the questionnaire regarding that, and updating enumerators will be conducting the survey. Enumerators will be recording the responses, and enumerators will have a list of organizations updated daily. So,
Regarding the challenge of it being open-ended, I think that's a really interesting and important point. And this might make things, totally unwieldy and cumbersome. But what if you split out the snowball sampling and the census? So you did the snowball sampling. You said, who else should we talk to? And then you go to those people, who else to talk to, until you hit the network boundary. So then you talked to before. You talk to all the referrals, and you can say with some reasonable degree of confidence, okay, this 125 people is the universe that we're looking at. And then you go back and census those 125 people. And then you can do a show card or whatever it is to say, a roster to say which of these organizations you have some kind of relationship with. And then it's more...
so it's like a two-step.
Yeah.
Interesting suggestion.
More expensive, but you will reduce the results.
It is an interesting suggestion. I'll take that under advisement.
We've designed some in a two-phase
there was that
process like that before.
On the one hand, we want to be consistent, but I wonder if there's a way to do it with your smaller network, where it's less difference in cost because it's by definition it's smaller.
And I also wanted to ask on that note, you had referred before to the potential challenge of referrals leading to referrals ad infinitum until the network is the size of the country. And what's your experience with that? How do you, just defining the boundaries in advance closely enough to say everybody who doesn't fit these is out, and we can be somewhat reasonably sure that it won't get to an unmanageable size, which also begs my other question, which is what is an unmanageable size? Like, at what point do the output graphs that you get, are they just black with white?
Yeah, which is a common criticism of social network analysis. Yeah, the analysts drop these maps and.
What do you think is a good number?
We think the network size, of each of these networks is probably it's very manageable. Probably according to these boundaries, somewhere in the ballpark of 75 to 150 actors per network. Yeah.
Probably fewer in the smaller ones, and the Managua one may well be significantly larger, but not beyond 300.
And more generally, that's where you guys think will yield useful analysis. When it goes beyond 150 or 200, it's out of...
I mean, the concept of... The point of all of this, really, and I guess when we see some of the examples, we can talk a little more about it, but the software exists and all the calculations are done behind the scenes. It takes more time if you've got a network of 10,000 or much larger even. The issue is that our tiny brains can't necessarily handle looking at a visualization of something that large. But scores come out as well that can help you to still understand those networks. So it's, you're right, there's probably a balance there, but the limitation is not due to the analysis itself or due to the techniques. It does impact, obviously, the more that you have to survey, the longer the survey portion will take. So it impacts the cost of doing something like this.
Should we talk now about that specific Nicaragua a bit more?
I think we have about 12 minutes.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, I mean, we've gotten good.
We could probably skip this. This is just saying what the ultimate reports will contain, just in terms of scores, maps of the networks, comparative analysis, and recommendations for future programming. But we wanted to highlight in Nicaragua what we think about Nicaragua and where we think some of this might go.
So Nicaragua, I mean, we've already given, I think, some of the flavor of what's happening in Nicaragua, but just maybe quickly, we do know that there is, as Patrick had mentioned, maybe the most important point is the last bullet here. There is a general absence of data that's just, it's difficult to come by or doesn't exist at all. And there's a lot of interest in getting information around workforce programs, workforce dynamics, numbers of even the number of training institutions that there are is at debate, let alone the number of students enrolled in these or what kinds of things they're studying. So there's just very little information out there and a lot of interest in getting that information, but very few people doing anything about it. There is a labor market demand study in progress right now run by possibly the same think tank that came up earlier. Funides is running this labor market demand study. But in general, we know there's weak alignment between youth interest, the TVET offering, and industry need. And a lot of that has been anecdotally attributed to very weak connections from the employer side to government and to the training institutions themselves. So the government, there is an entity called INATEC, which is the National Technical Center or institution, that is both a regulator of training, technical training, and a provider of technical training. They manage about 50 public centers, and they regulate those 50 plus we're estimating about 400, but as I said, even that number is hard to come by, private TVET institutions throughout the country. So, and they clearly, when they are not spending a lot of time, they're getting a lot of money from private enterprises, 2% of their payroll, in fact, but they are not, the private enterprises feel like they're not getting any of that value back. And INATEC says that they're engaging the private sector, but the private sector doesn't feel that. And at the same time, INATEC is then, as part of that process, they are defining what skills count and can be certified as something to train on, and what levels you can reach of that. So their lack of interaction is something that is anecdotally very important to the system. So with that in mind, this is a controversial practice of ours, and I've drawn the short straw on this one, but the controversial practice is we have been, on a number of occasions, creating illustrative, fake, fictitious maps of what we suspect something might possibly look like based on the insights that we have from the system. So this is just an example map of before what we think might be the case in a sample small network within Nicaragua. So, we often get people either looking at these saying, it's too complicated, I don't want to look at something like that, or we get people looking at it and finding all the faults in based on their experience. This is why we do the actual mapping. So we will find out and we'll share what the final map really looks like. But this is just to give an idea of what kinds of things we might see in a before map and what kinds of implications that might have on program design in particular. And one other thing that I should add, as I was saying before, sometimes you do look at these and it's complicated. I mean, this is an entire system. It's difficult to look at the map and instantly have some analysis there. And what we have found is that, and we engage sociologists in the analysis portion of this, it really takes a lot of time and to some extent just past experience looking at these and looking at the numbers that come out of the score side to really understand and interpret the data well. It's not just a matter of looking at it and clearly knowing, oh, this is a gateway organization or this is a hub that we can use. So, but some of the things that we think we're seeing here, or that we think we will see on a map in Nicaragua, is on for the people on the phone, maybe this isn't going to be super helpful, but on the upper right-hand side of the picture, you can see there's a government actor that clearly has all of the relationships with other government actors and is a gatekeeper here, which, is certainly, in some cases that could be a positive relationship, but probably in this case it's not, because it's all of a subgroup within the network, the government actors, that are now separated from the rest of the network, that's going to cause clear constraints on information flow, especially from or to government. So that would be something that we think we would see, and that would be something where in the program strategy or program design, you're definitely going to want to try to decrease the power of this kind of entity. Another central actor that we might look at is the business association, and that one actually might be one, they have a lot of these strong ties to employers, though employers are able to get around them to other actors. We may also want to look at them more as a hub as opposed to a constraint, right? So they may be a great way to bridge different types of actors that are on the map. Kind of just to try and point out that sometimes you might look at something that looks like the same structure of a node and the edges connecting it to other nodes, and you can interpret it in completely different ways, or you need to take a closer look and just see what are the implications this might have on a program design. So some of the things that we talked about might, some of the observations that are just listed on the side there, diffuse relations, there's presence of cliques or subgroups within. Like I said, the government actors all seem to be talking to each other, but not outside of that group. There's a few clearly central actors that, again, that may be very positive because they are a good way to diffuse, to disseminate information quickly, or it may be very negative if they're holding on to that information and not spreading it. Weak reciprocity. So one of the things that we will definitely be looking at is the direction of those relationships. If the business association right now you can see is mostly getting named as a collaborator by employers and not necessarily naming all the employers who are their members, that's an example of more a one-sided relationship, and we'd like to see that become more two-directional. Presence of gatekeepers, we already talked about. Structural holes. So there might be actually another couple things we need to point out on the left side. We do have this one group that's in the network by definition, but they're not connected really to the rest of the network, so it might be clear that that's a group that we want to get further engaged into the rest of the network. So some of the design implications might be related to engaging the business association further to diversify those relationships between the private sector in particular and other actors within the system, linking employers to the TVETs through both. There's an NGO that clearly has is a lot more central to this network. So linking the training institutions in particular to the employers through those two factors, those two actors. Creating some alternative pathways and promoting more of those reciprocated relationships. One thing that's we didn't map here, but we can map, and we are planning to based on the questionnaire that we're doing, is what Patrick was talking about, the strength of the relationship. This is simply a yes or no question, or a map that shows yes or no, are we connected, and not the strength of that. Typically, if we were going to do the map with the strength, the thickness of the line might show you how strong the relationship is. Or we could also run it we could run different maps based on the different types of relationships if we wanted to do that as well. So just to give an idea here.
Just a quick question. Is there a reason financiers are left off of this? Or I know this is illustrative. I know you didn't want to talk too much into transactions, but they seem to be such a big part of the lifeblood, both on the individual.
Yeah, and I mean, there's not a calculated reason that they're not on there, but we wanted to limit just for visual effect, we wanted to be able to kind of limit the different types of actors that we're looking at, just to be able to show a little better what kinds of relationships we're talking about. But yes, they will be included in the eventual map. So here's an example after possible illustrative fictitious map. And the first thing that everyone's going to look at and notice is, oh my goodness, there's so many lines on there, I don't know what I'm looking at anymore. But there's a lot more to it than that. So, and we've got some of the information here on the left and on the bottom on the impact or the changes that we might see. A lot of times when you're looking at something at this level, there will still be some clear visual effects on the map itself, the size of certain actors or where they fall within the map, and even being able to look at, do we still have these subgroups within there? We can see already, well, the government is much better connected to other actors, and that gatekeeper is much smaller than they were before relative to the other actors. So that's probably a very positive change. We can see that the employers are much better tied in than they were before. We can see that the training institutions are also much better tied in than they were before. That's just some of the visual stuff, but there's also a lot of scores that we can calculate on this, both at the network level and at the individual actor level. And so just taking a look at that, the density of the network increased. Just generally the number of ties increased, which is, to be expected, and we're seeing a lot more lines on there anyway. The reciprocated ties also increased, which was one of the things that we were targeting or saying we would potentially target here. The average distance decreased, and this is, a key measurement for network health, especially if we're talking about information dissemination. Obviously, the more distance that information has to cover, the more that it might get lost or not reach different members of the network. And so decreasing that distance is a clear step in the right direction. Between the centrality, that's a median, and so in the first map, the median organization was not central at all, and now we've got, at least to the median level, there's at least some centrality to those actors. So again, this is kind of a complex map to look at, but there is a lot that we can learn from it and a lot that we can see as changes over time. The numbers in terms of that data are not always, it's not always going to be clear that higher is better or lower is better. In general, we might know that a certain direction is where we want to go, but the ideal number may not be 0 or infinity, but somewhere in between. So those are some things that, network by network need to be assessed.
I think we're at our time limit.
Yeah.
Jackie, how long do we have the room for after this? Okay.
So there is time for questions, but we want to be respectful of your time as well. So maybe just see if there are any other questions or feedback from around the table or on the phone.
Even just from our perspective, we wanted to present this whole concept to people and get feedback on it. We've gotten, I feel like we've gotten great feedback already from everyone here on some of the key questions that we're asking and the design of the questionnaire itself, as well as the process or approach to gathering or getting to know those network actors. And these were really meant to be a little more examples and give you a little more detail, but to the extent that it creates more thinking or feedback or thoughts or questions, we definitely want to hear that.
I have a question that goes back several slides, if you will. When you design your survey, when you go out and speak with people, how do you define information? So what are you going to ask them for in terms of those ties? Do you get fill the blank from what's the question, the core question there, in terms of what's the exchange that those ties are going to represent?
Currently, the way it's structured, ultimately you're asking, you're assessing the presence or absence of relationships and potentially the strength of those relationships. In our case, we're doing both. To get at both if you're just asking presence or absence, you only have to ask one question. After asking about 20 demographic and attribute related questions, you ask, who do you work with?
Okay.
On workforce development issues, right? And ours is a bit longer because it's looking at the types. So we ask, who do you work with on this type of activity, that type, the other type, and what's your perception of those collaborations? And then on top of that, we have to get any contact information for referrals we don't already know exist. So.
Do you have frequency of communication? Because I've seen that asked, and I think it's helpful.
Yeah, that is
organizational.
That's a number. Yeah, that would be a lot easier if it was, something like a social media analysis or something like that. But to get accurate information on that would be a bit tricky. And we are putting a time on it. We think about a year is probably a good overall metric to capture all the different levels of collaboration.
I mean, you could ask those questions. We opted in this case to have the Likert scale 1 to 7 of perceived strength of the relationship, and let them decide whether frequency is more important than other aspects of a relationship. Sorry, maybe Mark.
Quick one. So you said perceived frequency or perceived strength. What about perceived utility? The government could call you every day, but call you for a shakedown. You give it a big negative. I don't want more interaction with them.
Right.
And also, you wouldn't necessarily say, "I work with them." When you say the phrase, I'm really interested too in the phrasing of the question. I think that's really interesting. So, who you work with, does that exclude certain kinds of communication, information sharing that aren't really collaboration or joint project implementation?
Yeah, agreed. And right now and we have to phrase this in Spanish also. So we'll probably work over the finer details of the language in Spanish, but it basically right now asks, who do you work with? Who do you have a working relationship with on workforce development activities?
And it's got some examples of what
it's got some examples
in relationship to have memories and get people to answer that.
Yeah.
And it's actually broken into three
questions.
So there's the working relationship one, then there's
joint initiatives,
and there's interactions, which is clearly the weakest and just gives people an opportunity to name other possibilities there. But that's also a good question about
I think utility is important too, because it's also kind of like, I think the logic is the more the better, the stronger the better, where that's not always the case. You could waste a lot of your time sitting in meetings. You could, spend a lot of time reporting to government where that doesn't affect your bottom line or allow you to expand.
Yeah, that's an interesting one.
And, utility is also going to determine whether you pursue actively those. So it could eventually even be, if this were not just a snapshot and you were really monitoring, it may be a predictor.
Yeah. And that's why I'm focused a little bit too on money and self-interest and motivation. People don't do anything just to do it. An employer's not going to say, yes, I support workforce development necessarily. They may, because they may think that's what you want to hear. But at the end of the day, and it's not a bad thing at all. I'm not criticizing it. But don't neglect, natural forces, of course. And
yeah, agreed.
So I don't know where. Oh, there's Nora.
So, hi, come back.
Yeah, we had a question this formally, and then just say that they're.
Sure. Yeah, so some of you had some feedback on the chat, which is great, and we'll share that with the presenters. There was a question as to whether you engage anthropologists in this analysis.
Sociologists.
Sociologists, yes. Okay. But we will be sharing, we're going to finish up now, but we will be sending out the presentation, and it will also be available on our website, wfconnections.org. And like I said, sharing your feedback, your written feedback with the presenters. So thank you all very much for joining us. We're going to conclude now.
The leader has disconnected. The conference will now end.